spring, it rained. Over the plains of Kansas and the fields of Missouri, it rained, rained, rained. It rained during 23 of the 30 days of June, with more in July. Telephone workmen called it a frog strangler. Finally, a mid-July deluge in central Kansas pulled the trigger. The soggy soil could take no more. Rivers burst their weakened dikes, and one of the worst floods in the nation's history was underway. On came the swirling floodwaters, down the Kaw, down the Cottonwood, down the Neosho, down the Smoky Hill. Onward rushed the frothy waters of the Solomon, the Republican, the Saline, the Marais de Seine, and the Blue, higher even than during the great flood of 1903. The water rose over cities and farms from Salina to Kansas City, and there, joining the already swollen Missouri, the flood swept on to St. Louis, down the Mississippi to the mouth of the Ohio. Kansas, Missouri, and northeast Oklahoma were to pay the price, for when the waters receded, they had taken a toll of 41 lives and left 500,000 families homeless and destitute. Property damage amounted to more than $1 billion. Homes and stores were twisted, tilted, and washed from their foundations. Streets were a mass of rubble. Telephone poles and wires were an almost hopeless tangle. And over everything, in everything, lay a mass of slimy mud that polluted the air for miles around, presenting a scene of desolation and destruction almost beyond description. But even before the waters had receded, rescue workers came by the hundreds to add their efforts to those whose families and homes had been disrupted. Truly, in this, one of our worst flood disasters, history will write a saga of courage and service on the part of all who took unto themselves the gigantic task of rescue and restoration. Red Cross workers, doctors and nurses, men and women from all walks of life, forgot self in their eagerness to help those who were less fortunate. It would take hours to record their heroic achievements. Telephone service, so badly needed to direct rescue work and to assure and reunite scattered families, also had to pay the price. 31 towns isolated with no service, 37,000 telephones and 400 long-distance lines out. Measured in dollars, the damage to telephone property crossed the $3.5 million mark. The story of the fight to protect and restore that service is one of men and women battling against incredible odds. In Manhattan, Kansas, telephone men raised the switchboard 16 inches. With calls mounting as frantic people tried to send or get help, telephone operators worked barefoot, the water swirling around their ankles. Finally, with only one line left to Topeka, the chief operator made a last dramatic call. "I'm afraid we're going to have to get out." In a few hours, the water in the office covered the switchboard shelf. The Manhattan telephone system was dead. But somehow, somewhere, calls had to go through. Calls for the Coast Guard, the Red Cross, the Army, and all the other agencies fighting to keep the town alive. 4 precious lines to Salina remained, so 4 turn-the-crank telephones were set up in this empty gasoline station. Here, the operator stayed on duty 24 hours a day, turning the telephone cranks, getting the calls through, and then letting the callers talk over the same telephones. 2 mobile radio units were rushed to Manhattan from Texas and set up for emergency use on a golf course. These units were connected to 2 more turn-the-crank telephones outside the same filling station. A similar center was established at Kansas State College. Meanwhile, help arrived to put the Manhattan switchboard back into service. Western Electric, the supply unit of the Bell system, sent installers from Kansas City, Salina, and Topeka to work side by side with other telephone men from Wichita and Manhattan. But it soon became evident that more disaster was ahead. The onrushing waters could not be stopped. Other cities and other communities would surely be flooded. telephone resources were quickly mobilized, and in a matter of hours, men, trucks, and supplies began pouring into the stricken area. On from Manhattan, the awesome tide bore down on Topeka, Ottawa, and then to reach and virtually paralyze the twin Kansas cities. Even cities as far away as St. Louis, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and Miami, Oklahoma, felt the blow. Telephone men and supplies continued to pour into the area. They came from Texas, Missouri, and Illinois, from Arkansas, Iowa, and Nebraska, to toil side by side in unison and understanding, using standard Bell system tools and standard work methods. And women came too, operators from Chicago, New York, and Louisville, to help handle the flood of urgent, frantic calls that turned each remaining switchboard into a blaze of light signals. Girls on vacation rushed back to help. At Salina, a single radio appeal for former operators brought twice as many as could be used. Many telephone workers had suffered personal disaster, homes flooded, wrecked, even washed away. But they went grimly about the job of restoring and operating vitally needed telephone lines. The lack of safe drinking water. Every telephone worker from Salina to Kansas City was given typhoid injections to avoid the danger of disease. Lashing currents wore a hole in a cable under this bridge, the main cable between Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas, and half the 300 circuits went out. To replace them and guard against further loss, plant men laid a cable on the sidewalk of the one bridge remaining between the two cities. In many places, boats had to be used to make repairs, as in this case where the flooded Neosho had battered holes in the long-distance cable that runs from Dallas to St. Louis. At this spot, one of man's oldest tools, the boat, joined with one of the newest, the walkie-talkie, to get the job done. The boatmen passed messages by walkie-talkie to the highway 2 miles away. Thence, by mobile radio telephone, they were relayed to a repair test board at Joplin, Missouri. With many long-distance lines out of service, mobile telephones in many cases served isolated communities. Between Salina and Topeka, power failed at 4 amplifying stations on one of the transcontinental lines. Portable generators were brought from Des Moines, Joliet, and Kansas City to keep the isolated stations working. And telephone material came in staggering quantities. Switchboards, 161 million conductor feet of cable, 5 million feet of wire, 26,000 telephones. It came from Western Electric distributing centers in Newark, Indianapolis, Chicago, and St. Louis. It came by truck, by air, and by the few remaining trains able to get into the flood region. With the flood only 2 blocks away and fire and explosions from burning gasoline rocking the neighborhood, Western Electric men at Kansas City worked tirelessly, receiving and reshipping the material needed in this dire emergency. Without the nationwide resources of Western Electric and its ability to supply everything from telephone poles to typhoid shots, the task of restoring vitally needed telephone lines couldn't have been done. And then, when the flood waters receded, came the slow, tedious job of cleanup and repair. Lines were down. Switchboards, telephones, and equipment of all kinds was soaked and useless, covered with an appalling coating of mud. Telephone laundries were set up to clean off the layers of silt before actual repairs could start. The equipment was first washed with hoses and brushes, then dried by electric heaters and fans. After the equipment had been cleaned and repaired, came the task of putting it back into service. Every telephone that really talked was an aid to the job of rebuilding and reuniting scattered families. The rains have ceased, the water has receded, and once again swollen rivers have retreated to normal levels. The men and women who came from other states have returned to their homes, families, and their jobs. But they will always be ready to answer a call for help in an emergency whenever or wherever it occurs. For they form a team that is spread over the entire nation. a team that works under the same standards of methods and service. The desolation and suffering caused by nature's whim in Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma may fade in memory with the years, but the courage and fortitude of all who did their utmost to help in an hour of need will remain forever in the hearts and minds of those who suffered.